The food truck came with the funeral, which was the first thing wrong with it. Emma Callahan found out she'd inherited it the way she found out most things that year, badly and second-hand. The solicitor's letter had gone to her old flat in Bristol, then to her mother's, then finally to the cramped one-bedroom above the launderette in Croydon, where she'd been living since the divorce, arriving 3 weeks late and smelling faintly of someone else's fabric softener. She read it standing up at the kitchen counter because there was nowhere to sit that wasn't also where she slept. The estate of Mr. Walter Brennan, it said. A 2009 catering vehicle, registration to follow. She hadn't spoken to Walter in 9 years. Her mother's uncle, technically, though everyone had just called him Uncle Wow, a man who smelled of engine oil and mint humbugs, and who'd once let her steer his van down a farm track when she was 8 while he worked the pedals. That was nearly the whole of what she remembered. That, and that he'd made the best bacon rolls she'd ever eaten, standing at a hatch somewhere off the A38, handing it down to her wrapped in white paper gone translucent with butter. And now he was dead, and she owned his van. You could sell it, her mother said on the phone that evening, in the tone she used for all of Emma's problems now, the tone that suggested they were minor and self-inflicted and slightly tiresome. Scrap value at least. What is it, 15 years old? 17. There you are then. Emma wound the phone cord around her finger. The flat came with an actual landline, a relic, the only phone she could afford to keep on, and looked out the window at the launderette sign buzzing pink below. He left it to me specifically. Not to you, not to anyone else. Me. Because you were his favorite when you were small. It doesn't mean anything, love. Sentiment isn't a pension. That was the sort of thing her mother said now. Since the divorce, since Daniel, since the whole slow, humiliating collapse of the life Emma had spent her 30s building, every conversation carried the same undertone. You had your chance at the good version of things, and you managed it poorly, and now we're all just being practical. She'd been a chef. That was the part nobody in the family seemed to remember correctly. Not a cook, a chef, properly trained, 2 years at Leith's, and then the hard climb through other people's kitchens until she'd made head chef at a mid-sized place in Clifton that got a good write-up in the Observer the same spring everything else fell apart. Daniel had been front of house. Daniel had also, it turned out, been 3 months into an arrangement with one of the investors, and when the choice came, as it always seemed to for women who'd built something they didn't legally own outright, Emma was the one who left. The restaurant kept his name on the door. She kept her knives, and a reference she was fairly sure he'd sabotaged, because 8 months of applications had gone nowhere she'd wanted to end up. So, the launderette, an attempt job doing prep at a chain gastropub where the kitchen was a series of vacuum bags and a combine oven, where a boy of 23 named Fitz told her she was reheating it wrong on her second shift and she'd said nothing, because saying something was a luxury and she'd run out of those. The van arrived on a Thursday. It came on the back of a recovery truck, and the driver made her sign for it in the rain. And when the ramps came down and the thing rolled backward into the launderette's loading bay, Emma understood immediately why her mother had said scrap. It was enormous and it was ruined. Once it had been cream and racing green. She could see that in the protected strips under the wing mirrors, but weather and neglect had taken it down to a mottled gray-brown, streaked with rust that bled from every seam. One tire was flat. The serving hatch was jammed half open, warped, and inside, when she climbed up through the back door with her heart going despite herself, she found a griddle furred with old grease, a fryer full of something that had solidified into a black disk, and mouse droppings across every surface like scattered rice. It smelled of damp and rot, and underneath, very faintly, of frying, a ghost of it trapped in the metal. She stood in the middle of it, rain drumming on the roof, and she did the thing she'd promised herself she'd stop doing. She cried. Not prettily. The ugly kind, with her hand pressed over her mouth so the recovery driver wouldn't hear through the open door. The kind that came from somewhere older and deeper than a broken van. The kind that had been waiting 8 months for an excuse. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve, because that was also a thing she did now, and she started opening cupboards. Most were empty. One held a rusted tin of what had been flour, and the last one, the narrow one beside where the till would have sat, was locked. That was the second thing wrong with it. Food trucks don't have locks on their storage cupboards. There's nothing to protect. It's crockery, it's napkins, it's catering-size ketchup. But this cupboard had a proper lock, a small brass one set into the wood, old and good quality, the kind you'd fit deliberately. And when Emma pulled at the door, it held fast. She looked at it for a long moment, rain on the roof, pink light through the warped hatch. Then she went to find something to break it open with, and that decision, though she had no way of knowing it yet, standing there with wet hair and grease on her hands, and her whole life folded down into a room above a launderette, was the one that changed everything that came after. The lock came off with a screwdriver and more force than finesse, the little brass hasp finally tearing out of wood gone soft with age. Emma pulled the door open expecting nothing. Old menus, a cash box someone had forgotten. The kind of nothing that had made up most of her recent discoveries. Instead, there was a biscuit tin, a wooden recipe box, and a bundle of letters tied with garden twine. She took them back to the flat because the light was going and the van had no working power, carrying them up the launderette stairs pressed against her chest like something that might escape. She laid them on the kitchen counter under the good lamp, and she started with the tin, because tins were safe. Tins were biscuits and buttons and old foreign coins. This one held photographs. Walter, young, impossibly young, standing in front of the same van when it was new, cream and green and gleaming, the hatch open, a queue of people in 70s clothes stretching out of frame. Walter in a paper hat, laughing. And beside him in nearly every picture a woman. Dark-haired, sharp-eyed, an apron over a floral dress, caught mid-laugh or mid-word or mid-work, her hands always doing something, flipping, plating, wiping, pointing. On the back of one, in handwriting that wasn't Walter's, someone had written, "Me and Wow, opening day Nadine's, June 1974. Nadine's. Not Walter's, Nadine's. Emma turned the photograph over in her hands. She'd grown up understanding, in the vague way families understand their own myths, that Uncle Wal had had a van once, did tease and that. Nobody had ever mentioned a Nadine. Nobody had ever mentioned that the van had a name on its side, and it did. She could see it now in the photo, painted in careful green script above the hatch, Nadine's Kitchen. She opened the recipe box next. And this was the thing that made her sit down properly, made her pull the wobbling kitchen chair over and lower herself into it, because the recipe box was not a jumble. It was a system. Index cards, dozens of them, each one covered in that same sharp handwriting, each one a recipe, but not the recipes Emma expected from a 1974 roadside van. Not egg and chips, not beans on toast. These were extraordinary. A card for a spiced lamb pastry with a dozen components, the pastry laminated, the spicing precise to the quarter teaspoon. A card for a chutney that called for tamarind and jaggery, and a technique for tempering whole spices that Emma had learned, expensively, years later, from a Sri Lankan sous chef in London, and had thought of as specialist knowledge. A card for something called Nadine's house sauce with the actual quantities scratched out and replaced 3 times, refined, a working document, a recipe someone had cooked and cooked and cooked until it was right. Emma read them the way she hadn't read anything in months, hungrily, professionally, her mind already tasting. Whoever Nadine was, she hadn't been a woman doing teas. She'd been a serious cook, a properly serious one, working out of a van on the side of a road in a decade when the English idea of foreign food was a tin of curry powder, and she'd been good, better than good. There were things on these cards Emma would have been proud to put on a menu in Clifton. She untied the letters last. It was fully dark by then. The launderette had closed, the pink sign had gone off, and the flat was lit only by the one lamp, and Emma sat in its circle of light and read letters between Walter Brennan and Nadine Acaffer across the better part of 2 hours, and by the end of them she understood 3 things she hadn't understood that morning. The first was that Walter had loved Nadine, plainly and completely, for the whole of a life. The second was that the recipes, all of them, the whole extraordinary body of work in that box, were Nadine's. Her family's, brought from Lagos and adapted on the side of an English A-road, then refined over decades into something that was neither one place nor the other but wholly hers. And the third thing, the thing that made Emma go very still in her chair, was contained in the last letter in the bundle, dated only 18 months earlier, in a hand grown shaky. It was Walter's, unsent, or written and never delivered, and it was addressed not to Nadine but to Emma herself. "Emmy," it began, "if you're reading this, then the box found you, and I'm sorry it's such a state, the van I mean. I couldn't keep it up at the end. There's something you should know about Nadine's recipes and a man called Marcus Vane, and I never had the schooling or the fight in me to do anything about it, but you always had both even when you were small. It's all in here. I'm sorry I left it so late." Emma read the name again. Marcus Vane. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. He was on television 3 nights a week. His face was on the front of 6 cookbooks stacked in every branch of Waterstones in the country. His restaurant group had just floated on the stock exchange for a figure the papers had printed with visible awe. Britain's home cook, they called him. The nation's kitchen. His whole brand was warmth and authenticity, recipes handed down. A man who talked in every interview about learning at the side of the ordinary geniuses of British roadside cooking. She looked down at the recipe box, at Nadine's house sauce, refined over 3 decades in a woman's own careful hand. And she thought about a jar she'd seen 1,000 times without ever really seeing it, on supermarket shelves, in the adverts, in Marcus Vane's own hands as he grinned at a studio audience. Vane's original house sauce, the taste that started it all. Outside, a bus went past, and the flat trembled slightly, the way it always did. Emma didn't notice. She was reading the card again, and then Walter's letter again, and somewhere in the space between the two, the exhaustion that had been sitting on her for 8 months lifted an inch. Not gone, but shifted, replaced underneath by something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She wanted to know what happened next, and for the first time in a very long time, she was the one who was going to find out. Sleep was out of the question, so Emma didn't try. She sat at the counter until 3 in the morning with the letters spread in front of her in the order she'd read them, and then she reordered them by date, and then by a second criterion she was only half aware of, which ones mentioned Marcus Vane, and she built, without quite meaning to, the beginning of a case. That was the thing about kitchens. They'd trained her to work in sequence, to have all her components ready before service, to never start a thing she couldn't finish. She'd lost a lot in the last year, but she hadn't lost that. Here was what the letters gave her. Vane hadn't come out of nowhere. Before the television, before the cookbooks, before Britain's home cook, he'd been a young man in the early 90s looking for a break, and one of the places he'd looked was a food festival in the West Country in the summer of 1993. A real one. Emma found the flyer folded into one of Walter's letters, cheaply printed, Taste of the West, Og Bank Holiday. Nadine had a pitch there. Vane, according to Walter, had spent the better part of 2 days at that pitch, eating, talking, asking questions, charming. He'd told Nadine he was writing a book about Britain's overlooked cooks. He'd asked to copy some recipes. And Nadine, who by every account in these letters was generous to a fault, and had spent 20 years being ignored by exactly the sort of food press that might have made her name, had said yes. She gave them to him gladly. Walter had written. That was the worst of it. She wasn't robbed exactly. She handed them over because a nice young man said he'd tell her story and put her name in a book. There was no name and no book. 2 years later, he's on the telly with her sauce in a jar and a story about his nan in Yorkshire. Emma sat with that. It was, she understood, both very bad and legally almost nothing. A recipe can't be copyrighted. She knew that much. Everyone in the industry knew it. It was the first thing anyone told you when you asked why so-and-so could get away with lifting your dish. You could copyright the words a recipe was written in. You couldn't copyright the recipe itself, the proportions, the technique, the taste. Vane could have stood on stage and said, "I invented this," and there'd have been no law to touch him. But Walter's letter wasn't asking her to sue over a recipe. Emma read it a fourth time and saw that clearly now. Walter was asking her to do something he'd never had the words or the confidence for. He was asking her to make people know. She died thinking she'd been forgotten, the letter said, near the end, and the handwriting got worse there, pressed harder into the paper. "That's the thing I can't have, Emmy. Not the money, I don't care about money. That she died thinking nobody would ever know it was hers. You can cook and you can talk and you never could stand a bully. Do what I couldn't." Nadine had died in 2019. Emma checked the dates twice. The last letter between them was 2018, and then nothing, and then Walter's letter to Emma in the winter before his own death, a man tidying his affairs and finding one thing left undone. She made tea she didn't drink, and she thought about Marcus Vane's face on the front of 6 books, and she thought about Daniel's name still on the door of a restaurant she'd built, and she was honest enough with herself, sitting there in the small hours, to know that those two things were tangled together in her now, that some of what she was feeling was about a man who wasn't Vane at all. She let herself know it. Then she set it aside, because a good cook keeps their stations separate, and she started making a list. She'd need to prove the recipes were Nadine's and predated Vane. The cards would help, if they could be dated. She'd need more than family letters, which any lawyer for Vane would tear apart in an afternoon as the grievance of a bitter old man. She'd need people. Someone who'd been at that festival. Someone who'd eaten at the Van in the 80s and could say, on the record, "I had this sauce 20 years before that man put it in a jar." And she'd need, she realized, to actually taste it. To make Nadine's sauce from Nadine's card, and know for herself that it was the same thing sitting on supermarket shelves under another name. Because if it wasn't, if this was an old man's grief making patterns out of coincidence, then she'd be tearing her own life apart chasing a ghost, and she'd had enough of that. She looked at the card. Nadine's house sauce. 20-odd ingredients, 3 crossings out, a method written in the shorthand of someone who knew it by heart. She'd need a kitchen. A real one, not a combine oven and a bag. She thought slowly, a van. It took her 4 days to get the van running enough to matter, and she did most of it herself, which surprised the mechanic more than it surprised her. His name was Idris Bello, and he ran a garage 2 streets from the launderette. A lean, unsmiling man in his 50s who'd looked at the recovery photos on her phone and quoted her a number that made her laugh out loud. Not unkindly, just helplessly, the laugh of a woman who did not have that number and never would. "Then you can't have it running," he said, and turned back to the car he was under. "What if I do the work and you tell me what I'm doing wrong?" He looked at her for a while. "You know engines." "I know I don't, but I learn fast and I can't pay you, so those are the options." Something in that got through, maybe the flatness of it, the absence of pleading. He wiped his hands and came out and looked at the photos again properly, and then he asked what a chef wanted with a wreck like that, and Emma found herself telling him more than she'd meant to. Not everything, but enough. The inheritance, the recipes, the name Marcus Vane, and at that name Idris's face did something complicated. "My wife buys that sauce," he said. "Vane's, she thinks it's lovely." It might be. It might also be a dead woman's recipe with his face on the jar. Idris was quiet. Then, "Bring it round Saturday. I'll tell you what you're doing wrong. That was how it started, the thing that would matter more than the engine, though the engine mattered too. Emma spent that Saturday and the 3 after it flat on her back under Nadine's van in Idris's yard, learning the difference between a fuel line and a brake line by getting both wrong, and Idris standing over her with his arms folded telling her, in the fewest possible words, what a fool she was being and exactly how to stop. He didn't charge her. When she pushed, on the second Saturday, he said something she'd think about for a long time afterward. My father cooked, he said, in Kano before we came. Nobody wrote down what he did, it's gone. He nodded at the van. Yours isn't gone yet. By the end of the month, the engine turned over. The hatch still stuck. The griddle needed replacing and the electrics were a death trap, and there was no earthly way it could serve a paying customer. But it ran, and the little kitchen inside it was. When Emma had scrubbed it for 3 days with degreaser that took the skin off her knuckles, a kitchen. She made the sauce on a Tuesday night, in the van, in the launderette loading bay, by the light of a work lamp run off Idris's spare battery. She followed Nadine's card exactly. She had to go to 3 different shops for the ingredients, and one of them was a Nigerian grocer in Peckham where she'd stood slightly lost until a woman took pity on her and walked her round the shelves. And that woman, Grace her name was, and she'd matter later too though Emma didn't know it yet, had glanced at the handwritten card in Emma's hand and gone still and said, "Where did you get that?" But that was a thread for another day. She made the sauce. She tempered the spices the way the card said, in oil until they sang, and she built it up in the order Nadine had set down. And the smell that came off the pan was the smell of the van in the photograph, the ghost in the metal made real. And when it was done, she let it cool the way the card instructed. Rest overnight, it's not right hot, and she went upstairs and lay awake. In the morning she tasted it cold, off a teaspoon, standing in the loading bay. Then she walked to the corner shop and bought a jar of Vane's original house sauce for £3.79, and she came back and tasted that, off a clean spoon. And she stood very still in the gray morning light, 1 spoon in each hand, and she knew. It wasn't similar, it was the same. Not a coincidence, not a genre, not 2 cooks arriving at the same idea. The same sauce, the same slightly unexpected sweetness at the back, the same warmth that built rather than hit, the same single strange grace note that Emma, tasting it as a professional, could tell came from one specific technique on Nadine's card that no one would arrive at by accident. Vane's version was flattened, industrialized, the edges rounded off for the middle of the country. But underneath the compromise it was Nadine's, exactly and unmistakably, and Emma had just made the original in a dead woman's van, and could prove to her own trained palate what she could not yet prove to anyone else. She set both spoons down on the counter. "All right," she said to the empty van, to Walter, to a woman she'd never met. "All right, I heard you." The problem with being right, Emma discovered, was that being right wasn't evidence. She spent the next fortnight learning that the hard way, in a series of phone calls and emails that all ended in the same polite nowhere. She started with a food journalist whose byline she'd respected for years, a woman at one of the broadsheets who wrote the kind of pieces that actually moved things. Emma composed the email 6 times. She laid it out cleanly. The van, the recipe box, the dated festival flyer, the letters, the taste test. She was professional. She was, she thought, convincing. The reply came 4 days later and was 2 paragraphs long and kind in the way that closes a door. "Fascinating story, and I'm sorry for your family's loss," it said. "But I have to be honest with you about what we can run. Recipes aren't protected. You'll know that better than I do. Without documentation that stands up, this is one family's word against a very well-lawyered public figure, and Vane's people would bury it and us before it saw print. If you ever get something harder, a contract, a witness who'll go on record, anything contemporaneous that names him, come back to me." Emma read it twice and understood that it was, annoyingly, good advice. She'd been thinking like someone who'd been wronged. She needed to think like someone building a case. The letters and the recipe cards proved that Nadine had these recipes, but a lawyer would say the cards were undated, that Emma could have written them last week, that the letters were the private grievance of a besotted old man. The festival flyer proved a festival existed. It didn't prove Vane was there, and it certainly didn't prove what he'd taken. She needed the 1993 festival. She needed someone who'd seen Vane at Nadine's pitch with her own eyes. So she started making calls to a bank holiday 22 years gone. It was slow, unglamorous work, and Emma was surprised to find she didn't mind it. There was something in it that suited her, the same patience that let her stand over a reduction for an hour without walking away. She tracked down the festival's old organizer through a local history Facebook group, a retired man named Jeffrey Price who was delighted to talk about Taste of the West and remembered Nadine warmly. Nadine, oh, marvelous woman, marvelous food. Why she never got on the telly I'll never know. And who did not, unfortunately, remember a young Marcus Vane at all? There were hundreds of them, he said. Young chefs, students, hangers-on, all of them milling about wanting to be somebody. I couldn't tell you one from another at this distance, love. But he could tell her something better. He'd kept things. Jeffrey Price was one of those men who kept everything. Programs, photographs, the account books, a whole plastic crate of Taste of the West in his loft in Taunton. And when Emma asked, with her heart in her mouth, whether she might come and look through it, he said he'd be glad of the company. She borrowed Idris's car. She didn't tell her mother where she was going because her mother had, when Emma made the mistake of mentioning the whole thing over the phone, gone quiet and then said, Emma, love, I'm going to say this once. You've had a hard time. You've lost the restaurant and Daniel, and I know it's not been fair. But you cannot fix all of that by picking a fight with the most famous chef in Britain over a dead woman's chutney. It's not stable. It worries me. Emma had said she understood, and had not said the other thing, which was that this was the least unstable she'd felt in a year, that having something to build was the thing holding her together, not the thing pulling her apart. Her mother wouldn't have heard the difference. To her mother, they were the same thing, obsession and purpose, and maybe from the outside they looked alike. Emma had stopped expecting to be seen accurately by her family a while ago. Jeffrey Price's loft smelled of dust and old paper, and gave up its treasure slowly. They spent an entire Saturday at it, Jeffrey narrating each item at length while his wife brought up cups of tea, and Emma learned to be patient with the narration because occasionally, buried in it, was gold. There were photographs, boxes of them, the festival across 5 or 6 years, and Emma went through them with a magnifying glass Jeffrey found for her, looking at every young face in every crowd behind Nadine's pitch. It was late afternoon when she found it. Not proof of the theft, nothing so neat, but a photograph dated on the back in Jeffrey's own hand, T of the W93, showing Nadine at her hatch, laughing, handing a paper plate to someone, and in the queue behind, unmistakable even at 25 years younger, even with more hair and a cheaper jacket, was Marcus Vane, watching her work, a notebook in his hand. Emma's breath went out of her. That's him, she said. Jeffrey, that's Marcus Vane. Jeffrey leaned in, peering. So it is. Well, I never told you they all came through. He said it mildly, a curiosity, a bit of trivia. He had no idea what he was holding, and Emma in that moment chose not to fully explain, because Jeffrey Price was a kind and talkative man, and she did not yet want the fact of that photograph traveling any further than this loft. Could I, she kept her voice level, could I buy this off you, or borrow it? I collect things about Nadine for the family. Jeffrey waved a hand. Take it, love, take a few. I've 1,000 of the things. And he let her leave with the photograph and its dated back and its notebook-holding young man, wrapped in a tea towel his wife insisted she keep, and Emma drove back to Croydon with it on the passenger seat and had to pull over twice because her hands were shaking. It wasn't enough. She knew that even then. A photograph of a man in a food queue proved he'd been there, not that he'd taken anything. Vane could say he'd eaten a nice lunch and gone home, but it was the first hard thing. It was the first piece that didn't depend on her family's word. It put him at the pitch, notebook in hand, 22 years ago, and combined with everything else, it was the first grain of something that might, with enough more grains, become a weight. She got home after dark. There was a message on the landline. She almost didn't play it. Nobody called the landline. It was mostly recorded voices about accidents she hadn't had. But she pressed the button while she filled the kettle, and a man's voice came into the little flat, smooth and unhurried and entirely unfamiliar. "Ms. Callahan," a pause as though he had all the time in the world. "You don't know me, but I represent some interests connected to the Vane Group. I understand you've come into possession of some old family effects and you've been making inquiries. I'd very much like to buy you a coffee and talk it through. I think we can make this easy and pleasant for everyone. Do call me back." And a number recited twice slowly. Emma stood with the kettle going cold in her hand. She'd sent perhaps a dozen emails. She'd made phone calls to a retired festival organizer and a food journalist. She'd told almost no one what she was really doing, and she'd told none of them Vane's name in writing except the journalist, who'd promised discretion. And already, someone connected to Marcus Vane knew who she was, knew where she lived, and knew her landline number, which was not listed anywhere under her name because she'd never bothered to list it. The fear, when it came, was clean and cold and clarifying, and underneath it, unexpectedly, was something almost like satisfaction, because a man with nothing to hide doesn't send someone to buy you a coffee before you've even accused him of anything. She saved the message. She wrote the number down in the notebook she'd started keeping, the one where the case was taking shape, station by station, and beneath it she wrote the date and the time and a single line. "They're worried, which means it's real." Then she made her tea and she sat down and she started planning what she'd say when she called him back, because she was going to call him back. She just wasn't going to say yes. He'd chosen the cafe, which told her something before she'd even sat down. It was one of those bright, expensive places near Blackfriars where a flat white cost the better part of £5, and every surface was engineered to say, "We are reasonable, successful people here." Neutral ground that wasn't neutral at all. Emma arrived 10 minutes early on purpose and took the seat facing the door, and when the man came in she knew him immediately, because he was the only person in the room not looking at his phone. "Ms. Callahan," he didn't offer a hand. He sat, unbuttoning his jacket in a single practiced motion, and set a slim leather folio on the table between them like a place setting. "Thank you for coming. I'm Julian Reeves. I do sensitive work for a number of clients, and just now that includes people who care about the Vane Group's reputation. You said that on the phone. You didn't say how you got my number." A small smile, not unkind. That was the disorienting thing about him. He wasn't a thug, he was pleasant. He had the manner of a good maitre d'. "It's my job to be thorough, Miss Callahan. I hope it didn't alarm you. Shall we order? The pastries here are genuinely very good, which in my experience is rare in this part of town." "I'm fine." "Then I'll be direct since you clearly prefer it and I respect that." He folded his hands. "You've inherited some effects belonging to the late Nadine Acaffer, recipe cards, letters, that sort of thing. You've formed a theory about their relationship to Mr. Vane's early career, and you've begun in a small way to test that theory in public. I'm here because we'd like to acknowledge generously the sentimental value of what you have and take it off your hands. All of it, cleanly." There it was. Emma kept her face still, the way she'd kept it still through 100 bad services, through Daniel, through the investor's lawyer explaining what she was and wasn't entitled to. "Take it off my hands," she said. "For how much?" Reeves named a number. It was not a small number. It was, in fact, a life-changing number for a woman living above a launderette and doing prep for a boy named Fitz, enough to clear her debts, enough to put down on a small place, enough to start again properly, a real kitchen, her own name on a door for once. He let it sit there in the bright, expensive air, and he watched her hear it, and he was good enough at his job not to smile. "That's a lot of money," Emma said. "For some old cards a court would say are worthless." "It's a lot of money for making a distressing situation go away quietly for everyone, including you." Just the faintest weight on the last two words. "You've had a difficult couple of years, Ms. Callahan." The restaurant. "The divorce. I'm sorry, that's not meant as a threat, it's meant as sympathy. You fought hard and lost things that weren't fair to lose, and I imagine you're tired. This is a way not to fight. You take the money, you sign a straightforward agreement, and you get to build the thing you actually want, instead of spending 3 years and money you don't have on a fight the law is not built to let you win." And the terrible thing, the thing Emma would be honest with herself about later, was that for about 4 seconds she wanted to say yes. Not for the money, for the tiredness. He'd found it exactly. The 8 months of applications, the combine oven, the loading bay, the sheer grinding weight of starting from nothing at 41. He was offering her a door out of all of it, and it would have been so easy, and no one would have blamed her. Her mother would have wept with relief. Then she thought about 2 spoons on a counter and the certainty in her own mouth, and she thought about the word straightforward agreement, which she'd learned the hard way meant a document that takes everything and gives it a nice name. "What's in the agreement?" she asked. Reeves opened the folio. He was expecting this. He slid a document across, and Emma read it the way she now read everything, slowly, and she found what she was looking for on the second page. It wasn't just a sale of the physical items. It was a full assignment of any and all claims, a non-disclosure clause with teeth, an acknowledgement, phrased as boilerplate, that she made no allegation against Mr. Vane and that the recipes were of unknown provenance. She would be paid handsomely to hand over the evidence and to sign a paper swearing there was nothing to it. "You want the letters," she said slowly, "and the cards, and the photograph." The smallest pause, half a second, but she was watching for it now and she saw it land. "We want to resolve the whole matter," Reeves said smoothly. But she'd said the photograph, and she hadn't told him about a photograph, and he hadn't blinked because he didn't know about it, which meant his people knew everything she'd put in an email and nothing she'd found in a loft in Taunton. Which meant they were thorough but not omniscient, which meant they were, underneath the flat white and the good jacket, guessing. Something settled in Emma then. The fear didn't leave, but it found its place, went and stood in the corner where it belonged, and what came forward instead was the thing Walter had named in his letter. "You never could stand a bully." "No," she said. Reeves waited, as if she might be pausing for breath. "No to all of it," Emma said. "I'm not going to sell you Nadine's recipes so you can put them in a drawer, and I'm certainly not going to sign a piece of paper swearing she never existed. She was a real woman and she cooked real food, and a man got rich off it while she died thinking she'd been forgotten. I'm not going to be paid to help him keep forgetting her." For the first time something moved behind Julian Reeves's pleasant face. Not anger, recalculation. He closed the folio. "You should think about it," he said, and the warmth had cooled by exactly 2 degrees, no more, a professional to the last. "The offer is generous today. These things tend to become less generous and more complicated the longer they go on. People find their circumstances can get difficult. Tenancies, references, the small machinery of a life. I'm not threatening you, Ms. Callahan. I'm telling you how it goes, because I've watched it go this way many times, and the people who don't take the coffee almost always wish they had." "Thank you for the coffee I didn't have," Emma said and stood up. She got as far as the door before he spoke again, and when she looked back he'd stayed seated, and he said the one thing that stayed with her longest, said it almost gently, as though he meant it as a real kindness. "He's not a monster, you know. Vane. That's what people always get wrong. He's not some villain twirling a mustache. He was a hungry young man who took a shortcut 30 years ago and then had to spend his whole life defending it, and he probably doesn't even think about her anymore. That's the thing you're up against. Not evil, just a very large, very comfortable man who genuinely does not remember doing anything wrong. You can't win against that with a shoebox of old letters and a sense of justice. Better people than you have tried. Emma stood in the doorway with the London traffic behind her. Maybe, she said, but better people than me didn't have the van. She walked out into the gray afternoon, and her legs were not quite steady, and she was fairly sure she'd just made her own life significantly harder in the specific, grinding ways Reeves had described. She believed him about the tenancy, the references, the small machinery. But she also understood something now that she hadn't understood over her cold kettle the night before. They'd sent Reeves early, with a big number, because the case was more dangerous to them than it looked to her. You don't spend that kind of money to make nothing go away. She got the train back to Croydon. She wrote it all down, every word of the offer, the NDA, the slip about the photograph, the parting speech. And under it she wrote a name she hadn't let herself write before, because writing it made it a plan and not just a wound. Grace Peckham, she knew the handwriting start there. The woman in the Nigerian grocer's who'd gone still at the sight of Nadine's card. Emma had been so deep in engines and lofts and lawyers that she'd almost let that thread go. But a woman who recognized a dead cook's handwriting on sight was a woman who'd known her, and a witness who'd known Nadine, who could speak to who she was and what she cooked and when, was worth more than any photograph. She had a photograph that put Vane at the pitch. She had recipes she could prove she could cook. And now she had a thread that might lead to a living person who'd loved Nadine and could say so out loud. It wasn't a case yet, but it was becoming one. Outside the launderette the pink sign was buzzing on as the light went. Emma climbed the stairs, and for the first time she didn't feel like she was climbing to a place she was hiding. She felt like she was climbing to a place she worked from. She put the kettle on, she opened the notebook, and she got back to it. Grace Adami did not want to talk to her. That was the first thing Emma learned when she went back to the grocer's in Peckham, and it was a lesson she should have expected. She'd walked in imagining the scene going one way, recognition, warmth, a shared cause, and instead Grace looked up from the till, registered who she was, and her whole face closed like a shop shutter coming down. You came back, Grace said, not a welcome. You knew her, Nadine. You saw her handwriting and you knew it. I've got customers. There were no customers. The shop was empty except for a boy stacking plantain chips and the smell of dried fish and floor cleaner. Emma stood her ground, which was a thing she was relearning how to do. Please, she said, 10 minutes, I'm not press, I'm not police, she left me her van. Walter's van, Nadine's really. I've got her recipe box and I've got a photograph of Marcus Vane standing in her queue in 1993 with a notebook, and I've got a lawyer buying me coffee to make me disappear, and I don't have the first idea what I'm doing. But I know it was hers. I made the sauce off her own card and I tasted the jar and I know. And I think you knew her, and I think that's why you won't look at me. Grace looked at her for a long time. Come back at 6, she said finally, when I close, and come round the back, not the front. She came back at 6. Grace let her in through a door beside the bins and led her up a narrow stair to a flat above the shop that was warm and crowded and smelled of something slow-cooked and wonderful. And she sat Emma at a small table and put food in front of her without asking, and only when Emma had eaten some of it, out of politeness first, and then not out of politeness at all, because it was extraordinary, did Grace sit down across from her and start to talk. She was my auntie, Grace said, not blood, church. When we came over in '88 I was 9 and my mother had nobody and Nadine took us in like it was nothing, fed half of Peckham out of that van and never charged the ones who couldn't pay. She turned a glass slowly on the table. So you'll understand I don't love it. A white woman I've met once turning up with her recipes wanting to make a fuss. I've seen how these things go. Somebody makes a fuss, gets a bit of money or a bit of fame off her name, and then it's over and Nadine's still nobody and now she's your nobody too. Used twice. It was a fair thing to say, and it landed hard, because there was a version of Emma's situation that looked exactly like that from the outside. "I don't want money," Emma said. "They offered me money, a lot. I said no." Everyone says no until the number's right. The number was right. It was more than right. It would have fixed my whole life. Emma pushed the plate away slightly, made herself meet Grace's eyes. "I said no because signing it meant swearing she never existed." That was the actual clause, that the recipes were of unknown provenance and I made no claim she'd cooked them. They'd pay me a fortune to put my name to a piece of paper that erased her. And I couldn't. Not because I'm good. I nearly said yes. I want you to know that. I sat there and wanted to say yes. But because at the end of it, I'd have taken money to help a rich man forget a woman who fed half of Peckham for free. And I've spent 2 years being the one who gets erased, Grace. Restaurant with my food and another man's name on the door. I know what it is to build a thing and watch someone else own it. I'm not doing it to her too. The kitchen was quiet. The slow-cooked thing ticked on the stove. Grace's face didn't soften all at once. But something in it shifted, some load-bearing wall of suspicion taking a little weight off, and she said after a while, "What is it you actually want then? Not what you don't want. What's the thing you're trying to make happen?" And Emma, who'd been asked to justify herself so many times in the last 2 years that she'd half forgotten, she was allowed a plain answer, found she had one ready. "I want people to know it was hers," she said. "That's all. Not a lawsuit. I've been told 6 ways there's no law for it. You can't own a recipe. Not to take Vane's money or his empire. I want it to be known. I want it so that when someone picks up that jar in the supermarket, some of them at least know whose hands it really came from. I want her name back on it. That's the whole of it. Walter asked me to make people know. And I think I can, but not on my own, and not without the people who actually loved her." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she got up and went to a dresser against the wall and opened a drawer and took out something wrapped in a clean cloth and brought it back to the table and set it down and unwrapped it, and Emma stopped breathing. It was a photograph album. Old, the plastic gone amber. And inside, page after page, was Nadine. Nadine at the van, Nadine at church, Nadine at what must have been 50 birthdays and christenings and Sunday lunches. Nadine cooking, always cooking. 30 years of a woman's life that no lawyer could call the invention of a bitter old man. And tucked in the back in a plastic sleeve were newspaper clippings. Local paper, South London Press, 1991. Peckham's best kept secret. A photo of Nadine at her hatch, a caption naming her dishes, her house sauce, by name, in print, dated. 2 years before the festival, where Vane stood in her queue with a notebook. "She kept everything," Grace said quietly, "and when she passed it came to me because there was no one else. I've had it in that drawer for 6 years not knowing what it was for." She looked at Emma. "Maybe it's for this. But I need to know you're serious, and I need to know you won't run when it gets hard, because it will get hard. That man has more money than God, and you've got a broken van." "It already got hard," Emma said. "They've started on my landlord." Because they had. That was the other thing that had happened in the week since the coffee. A letter to her landlord about unauthorized commercial use of a residential loading bay. Technically true, she'd been cleaning the van there. And suddenly a tenancy that had been month to month and never questioned was under review. Small machinery, exactly as Reeves had promised. Nothing you could point to. Just the temperature of her life going up a degree at a time. Grace heard it and understood it, and something in her set. "Right," she said. "Then you'd better tell me everything from the start. And Emma," she said the name for the first time, "you eat first. You look like you've been living on spite and cold tea. Nobody wins anything hungry." That night was the beginning of the second phase of it, though Emma didn't have a name for phases yet. It was the night the thing stopped being one woman in a flat with a shoebox and started being something with other people in it. Grace came in. Not all at once, not with a speech, but she came in, and Grace brought the album and the clippings, and more valuable than either, 30 years of names. People who'd known Nadine. People who'd eaten at the van across 3 decades and could say so. A congregation's worth of witnesses, some of whom would talk and some of whom wouldn't, but a living web where before there'd been Emma and a dead man's letters. And Grace brought something Emma hadn't known she needed, which was someone who wasn't afraid of Marcus Vane because she'd never once been impressed by him. To Emma, some small buried part of her still flinched at the size of the man, the television, the books, the empire. To Grace, he was just a man who'd robbed her auntie, no bigger than that, and standing next to her certainty made Emma's own feel less like recklessness and more like sense. Idris came in properly too, around then. He'd been helping with the van as a favor, half amused, but when Emma told him about the landlord letter, something changed in him. He had, she'd learn, his own long history with the small machinery of powerful men making poorer men's lives quietly difficult, and it turned his amusement into something harder and steadier. He finished the van, not just running right. New griddle sourced cheap through a mate. Electrics made safe. The hatch, finally, unstuck and rehung so it opened clean. And one Sunday, without telling Emma he was going to, he'd stripped a patch of the old paint back on the side panel, down through the gray and the rust to the original layer. And there under all of it, protected all these years, was a curl of the original green script. Dine's kid. You should bring it back, Idris said, when she came out and found him standing there with paint flakes on his hands. The name, whatever you do with all this, she should have her name on her van again. So Emma did. That became the plan's beating heart, the thing all the legal impossibility couldn't touch. She was going to get the van running and serving, and she was going to put Nadine's kitchen back on the side in green script, and she was going to cook Nadine's food from Nadine's cards under Nadine's name, out in the open in public, where people could taste it and ask about it and hear the story. Not a lawsuit, a resurrection. You couldn't copyright a recipe, fine. But you couldn't stop a woman cooking one, either, and telling the truth about whose it was while she did it. It was, Emma understood, both completely legal and exactly the thing Vane's people would least be able to bear. A lawsuit they could bury in process for years. A van on a street corner serving the original of his famous sauce, with the real cook's name on the side and her photograph in the window. That was a story. That was the thing the journalist had said she couldn't run without something harder. Emma was going to build her the something harder, out of food, in daylight. She just needed a pitch, a place to trade, and that turned out to be the next wall. Because you needed a license to trade street food in London, and a spot, and the spots were controlled by markets and councils and business improvement districts. And the moment Emma started applying, she started hitting a strange, consistent, unaccountable bad luck. Applications that stalled. Pitches that were available on Monday and gone by Wednesday. A market manager who'd been warm on the phone and cold in person and finally admitted, not quite meeting her eye, that there'd been some concerns raised about her, from where he wouldn't say. Small machinery. Everywhere she pushed, it pushed back, softly, deniably. They're keeping you off the street, Grace said, when Emma described the fourth dead end. Course they are. A van they can't stop is the one thing they're frightened of. So they'll make sure you never get to park it anywhere that matters. Then what do I do? Grace smiled for the first time in a way that had teeth in it. You forget the markets, she said. You forget the fancy pitches with the licenses Vane's money can reach. You come to Peckham and you park on a corner that belongs to us, at a church fair that doesn't need anybody's permission, and you cook for people who loved her. You start where he can't reach, and you let it grow from there. The first outing of Nadine's kitchen happened on a Saturday in the yard behind Grace's church, and almost nothing about it went to plan. The van wouldn't start at first, damp in the ignition, Idris swearing softly, 15 minutes of Emma standing in the cold with her stomach in knots before it caught. The griddle ran hotter on one side than the other and she scorched the first batch. She'd prepped for 80 and had no idea if 8 people would come. And the green script on the side, which Idris and a signwriter friend had restored over 3 careful evenings. Nadine's kitchen, exactly the curl of the original, looked, when they finally rolled the van out into daylight, less like a triumph and more like a dare. A dead woman's name on the side of a wreck, about to be tested in front of the people who'd loved her most. Then people came. Not 8. Grace had done her work. A fortnight of phone calls, a notice in the church bulletin, word passed hand to hand through a congregation that had never forgotten Nadine, even if the rest of the country never knew her. They came in ones and twos, and then in a steady stream, older people mostly at first, and Emma watched from the hatch as they saw the name on the van and stopped, and some of them put their hands to their mouths, and one old man stood in front of the green script for a full minute not saying anything at all. She served Nadine's food from Nadine's cards, the house sauce, the spiced lamb pastry, the chutney with the tamarind and jaggery. She'd practiced for weeks, and she cooked it clean and hot and right, and she handed it down through the hatch wrapped in paper the way Walter had handed her a bacon roll 30 years ago, and she watched people's faces as they tasted it. That was the moment she'd remember, not the press that came later, not the confrontation still ahead. This. An old woman named Comfort, who'd known Nadine 40 years, taking one bite of the sauce and going utterly still and then beginning, quietly, to cry, and saying, when Grace put an arm around her, "That's her. That's Nadine's. I'd know it anywhere. Where did you find her hands? Where did you find her hands?" Emma had to turn back to the griddle, so the queue wouldn't see her face. They sold out by 2. People lingered. The fair became something else, a gathering, a wake 30 years late that nobody had known they needed. And Emma, moving among them once the cooking was done, did the thing she'd come to do. She listened and she asked and she wrote down names. Who remembered the van in the 70s? Who had photographs? Who'd been at Taste of the West in '93? And one by one, gently, people who'd spent 30 years watching a stranger get rich off food they'd grown up on told her yes. Yes, I'll say so. Yes, you can use my name. Yes, somebody should have done this years ago. By the end of that single afternoon, Emma had what the journalist had said she needed and more. A photograph placing Vane in the queue, a dated newspaper clipping predating him by 2 years, recipe cards in Nadine's own hand, and now a dozen living witnesses willing to go on the record. Not a lawsuit. Something Vane's lawyers had no motion to file against. A true story with a queue around it. She should have known that was exactly when they'd stop being gentle. The escalation, when it came, was cleverer than a threat. Emma had been braced for the small machinery to get worse. The tenancy, the pitches, Reeves's quiet promises. What she hadn't expected was the phone call from a producer at a mid-morning television program, warm and enthusiastic, saying they'd heard the most wonderful story about a food truck in Peckham reviving a lost local legend's recipes, and would Emma come on air and talk about it? She almost said yes on the spot. It was everything she wanted, a platform, the story out in the open, national. It was Grace who stopped her, Grace who'd grown up watching how power protected itself. "Who owns that program?" she said. "Find out before you say a word." Emma found out. The production company was a subsidiary. 3 steps up the ownership chain, past 2 holding companies, sat a media group in which the Vane brand was a significant commercial partner. Vane's cookery segments, Vane's product placements, a relationship worth a great deal of money to both sides. The warm producer almost certainly knew none of it, but somewhere above her, someone had seen a threat forming in Peckham and reached for the oldest tool there is. Not to silence the story, but to own the telling of it. Get Emma on air in a friendly, fluffy 4-minute segment. Local woman honors old family friend. Aw, lovely, strip out the name Vane entirely. Let it air once and evaporate, and inoculate the whole thing. Turn a scandal in waiting into a heartwarming filler that made the accusation, if it ever surfaced later, looked like sour grapes after her nice moment in the sun. "They're not going to stop you talking," Grace said. "They're going to help you talk, just about the wrong thing. That's how the clever ones do it." Emma sat with that for a long time. It frightened her more than Reeves had, because Reeves she could refuse. There was a clean line and she could stand on the right side of it. This was subtler. This was being handed the microphone on the condition she said the safe version. And the terrible thing was how badly she wanted the microphone. How easy it would be to tell herself that getting some of the story out was better than none. That she'd name Vane next time. That this was a foot in the door. She turned it down. It was one of the hardest things she'd done. Harder than refusing the money, because the money had been for her and this was for Nadine. But she understood now that they'd let her have any platform she liked as long as she used it to say nothing. And the one thing she would not do was let Nadine's resurrection become a Vane production. Which meant she had to find a way to tell the story they couldn't own. And that meant finding one journalist, in the whole of the British food press, who didn't need Marcus Vane's goodwill to make a living, who'd take a story that would cost them access to the most powerful man in their industry, and run it anyway, and stand behind it when his lawyers came. Grace knew where to start looking, and Reeves, sensing the shape of what Emma was refusing, made his last quiet offer and then his first open threat. But that's the turn into the back half of part 2, and it deserves its own scene rather than a paragraph.